Rome, 897. A courtroom. Someone is seated in the defendant's chair, but he is not breathing, he is not speaking, because he was buried months ago. A body exhumed from its grave, dressed once again in papal robes, is placed on a throne. Judges stand before it. Charges are read. A verdict is reached. This is not a moment of madness. This is a trial brought against an authority that could not be silenced even by death. And this court was convened at the very heart of a dark period that would drag Rome into years of fear and chaos. But this trial was not a madness unique to Rome. The message being delivered. In the Middle Ages, power was not built only upon living bodies. In the early 9th century, in Frankish lands, the grave of a former king was opened. His corpse was brought out, because the claim to power of his descendants was still alive. The aim was not revenge. The aim was to declare that this dynasty's right to rule was no longer valid. Similar scenes unfolded in England. The body of a noble accused of rebellion was exhumed after death. His bones were displayed to the public. This was not a punishment. It was a message to the living. In the world of the church, however, the body carried another meaning. When the remains of a saint were transferred from one city to another, that city gained power. Pilgrims poured in. Privileges expanded. For this reason, bones were protected, sometimes stolen, sometimes divided. A body was as valuable as land. In this world, the corpse represented the past, and the past could be dangerous to power. That is why some bodies were not left beneath the soil. Body politics in Rome. By the end of the 9th century, Rome was not merely a sacred center, it was a fractured city. Imperial authority had weakened. There was no single power ruling the city. Rome was under the influence of rival noble families, such as the Dukes of Spoleto. The papacy appeared to stand outside this struggle. But in reality, it stood at its very center. A pope was not only a spiritual leader, he was the key to power in Rome. Papal elections were determined less by faith than by alliances. When a pope changed, it was not only a man who changed, but the balance of power itself. For this reason, in Rome, when a pope died, the matter did not end. His decisions, his appointments, the families he supported continued to live on in the city. And precisely because of this, in Rome, some accounts were not settled by the grave. Here, death was not an end, but could become a beginning. The shadow of Formosus. When Formosus died, Rome did not relax. On the contrary, the city grew even quieter, because Formosus was not an ordinary pope. The decisions he had made in life, the alliances he had forged, the sides he had supported did not disappear with his death. He had altered the balance of Rome, and those balances became even more fragile in his absence. To some, Formosus was a legitimate pope. To others, he was a figure who could never be forgiven. His papacy was accused of standing on the wrong side, of crowning the wrong kings, of sanctifying disputed alliances, and of violating church law by moving from Porto to Rome. But Formosus could no longer speak. He could not defend himself. He could not explain his decisions. And precisely because of this, his silence became dangerous. Because in Rome, a silent body could be filled with any crime desired. For some, Formosus's death was not a conclusion. It was an opportunity to rewrite the past, to reverse legitimacy, and to do through a dead body what could not be done to the living. The opening of the grave. Months had passed since Formosus's death. The earth had closed. Everything seemed finished. But in Rome, some grudges were not buried with the dead. The new pope, Stephen VI, had risen under the shadow of Spoleto. Formosus's legacy was still alive. The bishops he had appointed remained in their seats. The kings he had consecrated remained on their thrones. Arnulf's empire was still a threat to Rome. Burying a body was not enough, because the problem was not the corpse, but the legitimacy it left behind. The order was given. The tomb was opened. Formosus's body was brought out into the light of day. Decayed, reeking, defenseless. But this was not a burial. This was the preparation for a trial. The corpse was washed. Papal robes were forced back onto it. Its rotting hands were positioned into a gesture of blessing. A wooden throne was prepared. Formosus returned to Rome after death, but this time not as pope, as a defendant. And the court was about to begin. The trial. The dim hall of the Lateran Basilica was full. Cardinals, bishops, Roman nobles, a silent, tense crowd. But the defendant did not speak. His silence settled heavily over the room. Formosus's body was strapped to a wooden chair, the papal throne. A crown on his head, holy vestments on his body. The decay was partially concealed, but the stench spread everywhere. As the corpse slumped forward, hands from the shadows held it upright. Pope Stephen VI presided over the court in fury. He shouted, he hurled insults. What stood before him was not a human being, but a target, a curse. The charges were read aloud, illegally assuming the papal office, unlawfully transferring from Porto to Rome, violating church law, bearing false witness, crowning the wrong king, Arnulf. But the defendant could not answer. So, a young deacon was assigned to speak on Formosus's behalf. With a trembling voice, he responded in his name. Questions were asked, answers were given. Objections were raised, but weak, fearful. This was not a defense. This was, from beginning to end, a spectacle with a predetermined outcome. A performance staged within a closed church council before witnesses to formalize hatred. As the trial progressed, the goal became clear. Formosus's papacy would be treated as if it had never existed. All of his consecrations, all of his appointments would be erased. What was on trial was not only a body, what was on trial was the past. And if the past were found guilty, the present would be cleansed. The verdict was delivered. Formosus was condemned. But the punishment was not meant for the dead. Punishment and aftermath. When the verdict was announced, a silence fell over the hall. This silence was not mercy, but expectation. Formosus's body was no longer a pope. The court had not merely declared him guilty. It had decided to erase him from history. The trial ended. The verdict was delivered. Formosus's papal vestments were torn away. He was declared not to have been pope. The 3 fingers of his right hand, the fingers of blessing, were cut off. This was not a punishment. This was the destruction of a symbol. Rags were thrown over his body, and the corpse was dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber River. The message to Rome was clear. The past had been erased, but Rome could not be silenced. The people grew furious. The city erupted. An uprising broke out. The hatred Stephen VI had staged against the dead prepared his own end. Shortly afterward, he was deposed, imprisoned, and strangled to death. The same year, the same city, the same hatred. Then the decisions were reversed. Pope Theodore II convened a synod. He annulled the Cadaver Synod. He rehabilitated Formosus. The body was retrieved from the Tiber. This time, not in secret. Clothed in papal vestments, it was buried in St. Peter's Basilica. Pope John IX ordered the trial records burned. He forbade the trial of the dead. But the matter did not end. Sergius III came to power. He annulled those decisions. He reaffirmed the Cadaver Synod. In Rome, the past lurched back and forth. Hatred rose from the grave, then returned to it again. And years later, Formosus's papacy was finally accepted. Because the past cannot be judged, it can only be buried. And Rome tried to forget those dark days. Today, although Formosus's papacy is recognized, the Cadaver Synod remains one of history's strangest and most cautionary reminders. Power games played through the dead still remind us of the shadowed sides of human nature and politics.